I have waited more than 20 years to speak about what happened in 1999, not because I wanted to forget it, but because I was instructed very clearly that remembering out loud would come at a cost. Back then, I was a Norwegian national in my early 30s, former military, trained in cold weather security and long-duration surveillance. I was not important. That is precisely why they chose me. The approach was not dramatic. No black cars, no threats. Just a man in Oslo who knew my service record better than I did and asked if I was available for private contract work. He never mentioned governments. He never mentioned the United States, but his accent was American, and his confidence suggested authority far beyond a private company. The terms were simple: temporary assignment, Northern Norway, remote facility, extremely high pay, total confidentiality, no paperwork that could be traced, no official employer. Payment routed through a chain of shell accounts that vanished weeks later. When I asked what exactly I would be guarding, he smiled and said, "Something valuable, something sensitive." I should have walked away, but I didn't. 2 weeks later, I was flown north, far beyond civilian air routes, landing on a strip that did not exist on any chart I had ever seen. Snow, ice, silence. The kind of silence that presses against your skull. The facility itself was invisible at first, just rock and white emptiness. Only when massive steel doors opened in the mountain did I realize how deep underground it went. Inside, everything was different. Technology I had never encountered, walls that absorbed sound, lighting that hummed faintly like it was alive. The personnel were mostly American. Some wore uniforms with no insignia. Others wore civilian clothing but carried themselves like intelligence officers. They spoke little, and when they did, it was always measured. My role was explained in deliberately vague terms. I was not security in the traditional sense. I was a containment observer. My job was to monitor a specific sector during assigned shifts, report anomalies, and above all, never enter the inner chamber. They never used the word prison. They called it the asset zone. There were rules, many of them. No personal devices, no recording equipment, no questions, no deviation from schedule. And one rule repeated more than any other: do not attempt communication. That rule alone told me everything. For the first few days, nothing happened. I sat in a control room facing reinforced observation glass that looked into darkness. Sensors monitored something behind that glass. Biological readings, energy fluctuations, patterns I did not understand. Sometimes the readings changed in ways that made no sense. The scientists would whisper, the soldiers would tense. I was told not to react. On the fourth night, I noticed something that changed everything. The readings weren't random, they were responsive. When I shifted my weight, something shifted on the other side. When my heart rate increased, the sensors spiked milliseconds later, as if whatever was inside was not only aware of me, but focused on me. I reported this. They told me to log it and forget it. That was the moment I realized this assignment was not about guarding a threat. It was about guarding a secret, and perhaps guarding ourselves from the consequences of it. The Americans avoided my eyes after that. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. I began to feel like I was being watched just as much as the thing behind the glass. Sleep became difficult. Dreams came uninvited. Images of stars, of falling, of something vast trying to speak without a mouth. I still hadn't seen the asset, only felt it. And deep down, before I ever laid eyes on the creature they paid me to watch, I already knew one terrifying truth. Whatever was being held beneath the ice was not afraid of us. It was studying us. And in 1999, I was about to learn why. By the second week, I understood something most of the personnel refused to admit, even to themselves. The facility was not built for defense. It was built for containment, and not containment of a weapon, but of knowledge. The deeper levels of the base were accessed only by biometric clearance. I never went below level 3, but I didn't need to. The air changed the closer you got to the restricted sector. It felt heavier, colder, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Even hardened American soldiers slowed their steps there, voices dropping instinctively, like men walking through a cathedral they did not believe in, but still feared. From my observation room, I began to notice patterns. The asset zone was never empty, not truly. The darkness behind the reinforced glass wasn't the absence of light, but something else. It absorbed illumination unnaturally. When the lights intensified, the darkness remained intact, like a shadow that refused to obey physics. I asked one of the technicians about it. He didn't answer. He just looked at me for a long moment and said, "You don't want to understand how that works." The Americans rotated shifts frequently. No one stayed too long near the asset. Later, I realized why. Prolonged exposure caused changes, subtle at first. Migraines, nosebleeds, memory lapses. One scientist began forgetting common words. Another broke down crying for no apparent reason during a routine briefing. They were not being attacked. They were being affected. Every morning, reports were sent out through encrypted channels. I once caught a glimpse of the destination headers before a supervisor shut the screen down. Langley, Wright-Patterson, places that had no business communicating with a frozen mountain in Norway unless something had gone terribly off the books. The cover story, I later learned, was geological research, deep earth anomalies, experimental energy containment, lies layered on top of lies, thick enough to satisfy politicians and thin enough to crack under pressure. And pressure was building. The asset, whatever it was, had rhythms, cycles, periods of intense activity followed by long stretches of stillness. During the stillness, the base relaxed, jokes returned, coffee tasted normal again. During activity spikes, everything changed. Sirens stayed silent, but the tension was unmistakable. Hands hovered near weapons that no one openly admitted would be useless. One night, during a storm that rattled the mountain like an animal trying to shake off fleas, the power flickered. Just for a second. That second changed my life. Emergency lights activated, bathing the observation room in red. Alarms did not sound, which meant the system did not consider this a breach. But the sensors went wild. Readings jumped off the charts, energy levels, neurological patterns, spatial distortions that had no units of measurement I recognized. And then, for the first time, the darkness moved. Not violently, not suddenly. It shifted, like something adjusting its posture. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to step back, to call it in, to follow protocol. But protocol felt meaningless in that moment. I wasn't facing a threat display, I was facing awareness. A shape emerged, not fully, not clearly. Just enough to confirm what my mind had been trying to deny. This was no machine, no experiment gone wrong. The movement was deliberate, controlled, intelligent. I remember whispering, without realizing I was doing it, "My God!" The moment the words left my mouth, the senses stabilized. As if something had acknowledged me, I reported the incident, of course, or at least part of it. I mentioned the power fluctuation, the sensor spike. I did not mention the movement. I did not mention the feeling that flooded my chest, the unmistakable sensation of being noticed. The response was swift. New restrictions, psychological evaluations. I was reassigned to longer shifts but fewer interactions. Isolation disguised as trust. That night, alone in my bunk, I realized something else that terrified me more than the creature behind the glass. This installation was not failing. It was being tested. And whoever or whatever was inside was not trying to escape. It was waiting for someone willing to listen. And I had a growing fear that whether I wanted it or not, that someone was me. The first time I truly saw the entity, it was not because I disobeyed orders. It was because the facility itself betrayed them. 3 nights after the storm, a controlled diagnostic was scheduled in the asset zone. I was informed only because my station was required to remain active during the procedure. Minimal exposure, they said. No visual engagement. The phrasing alone told me they were lying to themselves. The lights behind the reinforced glass intensified gradually, like a sunrise that did not belong on Earth. The darkness resisted at first, then thinned just enough. That was when I saw it. The entity was not tall in the way humans measure height, but it occupied space differently. Its body, or what passed for one, did not conform to symmetry. Limbs were present, but not arranged for walking as we understand it. The surface of its form was not skin, not metal, not anything I had words for. It shimmered faintly, as if reality itself was uncertain about how to render it. But the eyes, that is what broke me. They were large, yes, but not grotesque. There was no malice in them, no hunger, no rage. What I saw instead was something far worse for my sense of order, recognition. The moment the light reached a certain threshold, those eyes aligned directly with mine, through layers of glass, sensors, and steel. It knew exactly where I was. My breath caught in my throat. Training evaporated. I was no longer a former soldier or a contracted observer. I was an exposed human being standing in front of something ancient and aware. The technicians spoke rapidly behind me. Numbers were read aloud, commands issued. None of it mattered, because in that instant the entity leaned, if that word can be used, slightly forward. And then it happened. There was no sound, no vibration, no physical sensation at all. Yet my mind was suddenly no longer alone. Images flooded in, not as pictures but as experiences. A cold far deeper than Norway's winters. A silence between stars. The sensation of watching civilizations rise and collapse like brief sparks in an endless dark. I dropped to one knee, gripping the edge of the console, heart pounding so hard I was certain it would give me away. Someone shouted my name, but the voice felt distant, unimportant. The entity did not speak in language. It communicated in understanding. Concepts arrived whole, without translation. And the first thing it conveyed was not fear, not threat, not superiority. It conveyed disappointment, not in me, in us. I saw Earth, not as a map, but as a living system, oceans breathing, forests pulsing, species intertwined in fragile balance. Then I saw fractures, wars, borders drawn in blood, weapons tested with pride, leaders shaking hands while planning extinction behind closed doors. And through it all, the same message pressed gently but relentlessly into my consciousness. You do not know yourselves. I gasped aloud. That broke the connection. Alarms finally sounded. Red lights flashed. Armed personnel flooded the observation room. I was pulled back, restrained, questioned all at once. They asked what I saw, what I heard, what it said. I told them nothing. Not because I was ordered to, but because I knew with chilling certainty that they did not want the truth. They wanted control. Medical evaluations followed, brain scans, psychological screenings. I passed them all, though one American doctor lingered longer than the others, studying me as if I were no longer fully human. That night, I did not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that presence again, not inside my head but close, patient, observing. I understood then that the rules had changed. The entity had not simply revealed itself, it had chosen me. And whatever it was about to tell me next would make returning to normal life impossible. Because once you realize humanity is being judged, not attacked, not invaded, but evaluated, you cannot unknow it. And somewhere beneath the ice, behind reinforced glass and desperate lies, something far older than our nations was waiting to finish the conversation we had barely begun. After the incident, they tried to erase me quietly, not with bullets or prison cells, but with procedure. I was removed from active observation duty and reassigned to a monitoring role with no direct visual access to the asset zone. Officially, this was for my psychological well-being. Unofficially, it was because I had crossed an invisible line. But the problem with lines like that is this: once crossed, they cannot be uncrossed. The entity did not need my proximity anymore. It had already learned how to reach me. The first contact after that happened in my sleep. There was no dream narrative, no imagery at first, just a sudden awareness that I was not alone in my own mind. I sat upright in my bunk, heart racing, breath shallow. The room was dark, silent, yet something was present, closer than breath, more intimate than thought. Then the understanding returned, not forcefully, not invasively. It arrived like a hand placed gently on the shoulder of my consciousness. This time, the entity showed me itself, or at least the closest approximation my human mind could process. It was not from a single place. It did not belong to one world. It existed as part of something vast, a network of awareness that did not conquer, did not rule, but observed and intervened only when necessary. Earth, it explained, was classified as a threshold species world, a place where intelligence had reached technological adolescence without emotional maturity. The entity did not judge individuals, it judged patterns. Humanity's greatest danger, it conveyed, was not aggression, but denial. The refusal to see itself honestly, the tendency to mythologize violence as progress and destruction as destiny. I asked, without speaking, why it was here. The answer came immediately. It was not sent to study us, it was sent to warn. The warning had been delivered to governments decades earlier, carefully, selectively. Leaders had been shown probabilities, paths humanity might take if certain technologies were developed without restraint: energy weapons, autonomous warfare, planetary-scale environmental collapse. Not certainties, but escalating likelihoods. Most leaders responded with fear, some responded with greed, a few responded with arrogance, and so the entity was captured, not through force, but through betrayal, lured by the promise of dialogue. Contained using technology derived from earlier exchanges, technology never meant to restrain a sentient being. That was the moment the entity's tone changed. For the first time, I felt something like sorrow ripple through the connection. It explained that captivity was not the true danger. It could endure confinement. Time meant little to it. The danger was what humanity learned from imprisoning it. Reverse-engineered fragments, partial understandings, weapons built from concepts stripped of context and restraint. Humanity, the entity showed me, was repeating the same pattern that had ended countless civilizations before it, mistaking access to knowledge for wisdom. I felt sick. I asked why it was telling me. The answer was devastatingly simple: because I still felt guilt. The entity had evaluated thousands within the facility: scientists, soldiers, administrators. Most were loyal, some were cruel, many were indifferent. But guilt, it explained, was rare. Guilt meant awareness without justification. Guilt meant choice. That made me useful. Over the following nights, the contact continued. Always silent, always precise. The entity never commanded me, never begged. It simply showed me futures branching endlessly, some where humanity corrected itself, others where it burned bright and vanished. In many of the darker paths, the trigger was the same: fear-driven secrecy, unchecked power, and one imprisoned voice that was never allowed to finish its warning. By the end of the week, I understood the truth that would shatter my life. I had not been hired to guard an alien. I had been placed unknowingly between humanity and its last mirror. And soon I would be forced to decide whether that mirror remained locked behind glass or was set free to reflect us honestly, no matter the cost. The fifth night after our silent conversations began, the entity changed its approach. Until then, everything it had shown me came in fragments, images, emotions, probabilities layered on top of one another. But that night, when the connection formed, there was a deliberate structure to what it shared. A beginning, a sequence, a purpose. I understood immediately. This was not curiosity anymore. This was testimony. The entity showed me humanity as it saw us. Not through morality, not through politics, but through patterns observed over time. It had studied us far longer than any civilization studies itself. Thousands of years, compressed into moments inside my mind. It began with something unexpected: admiration. Humans, it conveyed, were uniquely intense, emotionally volatile, yes, but also capable of extraordinary compassion. No other intelligent species it had encountered loved with such desperation or sacrificed with such irrational devotion. That trait alone had once marked us as promising. Then the vision shifted. I saw our cities from above, glowing networks at night, veins of light spreading across the planet. At first it was beautiful. Then the glow intensified until it became harsh, consuming. Expansion without restraint, growth without balance. The entity did not accuse, it analyzed. It showed me how humanity consistently confused intelligence with wisdom, how we measured success by dominance rather than harmony, how we built systems that rewarded the least restrained among us and called it leadership. Then came the part that made my hands tremble in the real world: governments. The entity revealed that contact had not been accidental. Humanity had been noticed the moment we learned to split the atom. That single act had echoed far beyond our planet, not as a threat, but as a signal. A declaration that a young species had discovered power before understanding consequence. Initial contact attempts were subtle, observational, limited. When communication was finally established, it was not with scientists, but with military structures, chains of command, secrecy frameworks. That choice the entity conveyed sealed a trajectory. Leaders were shown futures, not prophecies, but outcomes based on probability. Environmental collapse accelerated by unchecked industry. Autonomous weapons making moral decisions at machine speed. Space becoming an extension of geopolitical conflict rather than exploration. Some leaders were afraid, some were humbled, but too many saw opportunity. Technology was requested, not guidance, tools. The entity showed me how its warnings were reframed as leverage, how cooperation became negotiation, how curiosity turned into containment. And then, the truth I had been avoiding settled fully into my chest. The entity had not been captured because it was weak. It had been captured because it trusted us too early. It told me that humans are most dangerous not when we hate, but when we justify. When we convince ourselves that harm is necessary, progress inevitable, sacrifice unavoidable, as long as someone else pays the price. I felt a surge of shame so intense it nearly broke the connection. That emotion, the entity noted calmly, was rare. It showed me why it had chosen to speak to me more deeply than others. Not because I was important, not because I was brave, but because I had not tried to excuse what I was seeing. Most humans, it explained, respond to uncomfortable truth by reframing it, by softening it, by finding someone else to blame. I hadn't. I simply felt it. The entity then shared something that changed the meaning of everything. It was not here to judge humanity's past. It was here to assess whether humanity deserved a future, not extinction, isolation. There were civilizations, it explained, that reached our level and were quietly excluded from wider contact, left alone to either stabilize or destroy themselves. Others were guided carefully forward. Humanity stood at that threshold, and our obsession with secrecy, dominance, and control was pushing us rapidly toward the wrong side of that line. The final message it gave me that night was not a warning. It was a question, one that still echoes in my mind decades later. If your species cannot be honest with itself, why should the universe trust it with anything more? When the connection faded, I was left alone in my quarters, shaking, not with fear, but with the unbearable weight of responsibility, because I now understood something the people paying me would never accept. The entity was not our prisoner, it was our evaluation, and if it remained caged, the verdict had already been decided. After what the entity revealed to me about humanity, everything around the facility began to look different. Conversations I overheard in hallways, briefings conducted behind sealed doors, even the way the Americans avoided certain topics, all of it suddenly formed a coherent, disturbing picture. The truth was already there. I just hadn't known how to see it. The entity showed me the agreements, not documents, not signatures, understandings. Arrangements forged quietly over decades, hidden behind layers of classification and denial. The first contacts, it explained, had terrified human leadership, not because of invasion, but because of exposure. Exposure of how fragile our power structures truly were. Governments demanded control before cooperation. That was humanity's mistake. The entity revealed that limited technological guidance had been offered early on, not weapons, but stabilizing knowledge. Energy systems meant to replace destructive extraction, communication models designed to reduce conflict escalation, methods of environmental recovery that could have reversed damage already done. Most of it was rejected. What was accepted were fragments, incomplete ideas stripped from their ethical frameworks. Human scientists, brilliant but impatient, reverse-engineered concepts without understanding the larger systems they belonged to. And that was how the deals began. Access in exchange for silence, silence in exchange for influence, influence in exchange for containment. The entity was not the first of its kind to interact with humanity, but it was the first to refuse the final stage of cooperation once it realized how the information was being used. That refusal, it explained, triggered fear among human authorities. Fear turned into contingency planning. Contingency planning turned into betrayal. The entity showed me the moment it was captured, not violently, not dramatically, but clinically, invited under the pretense of negotiation, isolated through fields tuned to its neural structure, immobilized using systems derived from its own earlier guidance. Humanity had learned quickly, too quickly. Once contained, the entity became leverage, a bargaining chip in internal power struggles between nations that publicly denied its existence. The facility in Norway was only one node in a global web. Research centers, intelligence divisions, black budget programs, all feeding off the same forbidden source. I asked why the entity did not simply leave. The answer was chilling, because leaving would accelerate the outcome. If humanity believed it could capture, study, and weaponize a higher intelligence without consequence, it would repeat that behavior again, more aggressively, more recklessly. The entity remained to slow us down, to observe, to decide whether intervention was still justified. That decision was not unanimous among its kind. Some believed humanity was already lost. Others believed we were simply young and dangerously impulsive. The entity I guarded belonged to the latter group. It showed me projections of what would happen if its imprisonment continued. Technological leaps without moral alignment, surveillance systems justified by security, autonomous systems making irreversible decisions without human empathy, wars fought faster than diplomacy could function, not science fiction, near-term inevitabilities. I began to understand why the base felt less like a research facility and more like a dam holding back a flood. The Americans weren't guarding against an alien escape. They were guarding against accountability. The entity also showed me why I had not been removed entirely after my contact incident. I was being monitored, not as a threat, but as a variable. Someone wanted to know whether prolonged exposure to the entity could alter human behavior in unpredictable ways. I was part of an experiment. That realization made my blood run cold. I was not trusted, but I was being watched closely, and that meant time was running out. The entity sensed my growing fear and responded with something unexpected: reassurance. It conveyed that fear was natural but not decisive. What mattered was action guided by clarity, not panic. It then revealed one final truth about the agreements. They were already breaking down. Competing human factions wanted different outcomes. Some wanted to disclose partial truths. Others wanted to escalate exploitation. A few wanted to eliminate the entity entirely once they extracted enough data. That was when the entity delivered its most urgent message yet. If humanity chose to kill what it could not fully control, the evaluation would end permanently, and whatever remained beyond our planet would respond, not with punishment, but with absence. No guidance, no second chances, just silence. When the connection faded, I sat alone in the dim light of my quarters, hands clenched, heart racing. I finally understood the position I had been placed in, not by chance, not by fate, but by convergence. The agreements were collapsing. The entity's patience was ending, and soon someone, human or otherwise, would force a conclusion. I realized then that my role was no longer passive. I was no longer a guard. I was a witness standing at the edge of a decision that would define not just my life, but humanity's place in the universe. After the entity revealed the truth about the secret agreements, I stopped seeing the facility as a place of work. It became something else entirely, a crossroads disguised as concrete and steel. Every corridor felt heavier, every conversation sharper, as if reality itself was tightening around an inevitable decision. I could no longer pretend neutrality. That was the hardest realization. For weeks, I tried to return to routine. I logged data. I nodded during briefings. I followed orders. But inside, something had shifted permanently. Once you understand that you are complicit in a lie that could define the fate of your species, just doing your job becomes an act of cowardice. The entity sensed my inner conflict before I consciously accepted it. During our next contact, it did not show me visions of the future or memories of the past. Instead, it showed me myself, not as I was, but as I could be. A man who walked away, a man who obeyed, a man who acted. Each version branched into different outcomes. None of them were heroic in the way humans like to imagine. No speeches, no recognition, only consequences. I asked it, silently, what it wanted me to do. The response was immediate and unsettling. It did not want anything. Choice, the entity explained, only had meaning if it was freely made. If it commanded me, the evaluation would be invalid. Humanity would have proven itself incapable of moral agency under pressure. That understanding was devastating. The weight of responsibility settled entirely on me. Around the facility, tension escalated, armed personnel doubled, new equipment arrived, devices whose purpose was never explained. High-ranking officials began appearing unannounced, speaking in hushed tones behind sealed doors. I overheard fragments of conversations that confirmed my worst fears. Termination protocol, asset neutralization, data extraction complete. They were preparing to end it, not because the entity was dangerous, but because it had outlived its usefulness. The entity showed me what would happen if that choice was made. Not retaliation, not invasion, something colder, disengagement. Humanity would be classified as a closed system, left alone with its technologies, its conflicts, its accelerating self-destruction. No external intervention, no guidance, no watchers willing to step in when we crossed irreversible thresholds. We would not be punished, we would be ignored. That, the entity conveyed, was the fate of most civilizations that failed the evaluation. I barely slept during that time. When I did, I dreamed of silence stretching across the stars, of Earth shouting into the void and receiving nothing in return. I woke each time with the same thought pounding in my skull. Someone has to choose. The facility's systems were designed to prevent unauthorized access, but not sabotage from within. Human error, after all, is always the weakest link. I began noticing small things. Redundancies that relied on trust, procedures that assumed loyalty. I did not plan a dramatic escape. I planned a moment, a narrow window when a storm would disrupt satellite communications, when backup generators would divert attention, when human confidence in their own systems would betray them. Throughout it all, the entity remained calm. It never rushed me, never pressured. That patience frightened me more than any threat. On the night I made my decision, I stood alone in the access corridor outside the asset zone. My hand hovered over the clearance panel, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I realized then what terrified me most. Not that I might fail, but that I might succeed. Because success meant living with the knowledge that I had defied nations, broken laws I didn't even know the names of, and rewritten a chapter of human history that would never be acknowledged. I asked the entity one final question. What happens if I let you go? The answer was not a promise. It was a possibility. A chance, it conveyed, for your species to be judged by what it chooses, rather than by what it fears. That was enough. I placed my hand on the panel and crossed the line no one was ever supposed to cross. In that moment, I stopped being a guard. I became something far more dangerous, a human who chose conscience over control. The storm arrived exactly as the forecast predicted, violent, sudden, and loud enough to mask almost anything beneath it. Winds howled across the mountain like something alive, slamming against steel and stone. Snow buried sensors. Ice interfered with external communications. For the first time since my arrival, the facility felt vulnerable. That vulnerability was my opening. I moved through the corridors with deliberate calm. Panic would have betrayed me faster than any alarm. I followed procedure where possible, blending into routine like I had done for weeks. My access credentials still worked. No one had revoked them yet. Human systems always assume loyalty until the moment it's too late. In the control wing, technicians were busy stabilizing power fluctuations caused by the storm. Backup generators hummed at near capacity. Attention was divided. That was critical. I reached the access corridor to the asset zone without challenge. The reinforced door stood before me, unchanged and impersonal. Layers of security separated me from the decision I had already made in my mind. I entered the override sequence slowly, manually, disabling automated alerts, one subsystem at a time. The entity had shown me where to focus, not through instructions, but through understanding. The facility's designers had planned for external threats. They had not planned for guilt. As the final lock disengaged, I felt the presence before I saw it. The air shifted, the pressure changed, like a held breath finally released. The lights flickered, not in alarm, but in response. The entity emerged from the darkness, no longer constrained by containment fields. It did not rush. It did not hesitate. It simply moved forward, its form stabilizing as if reality itself was accommodating its decision to leave. For a brief moment, we stood facing one another with nothing between us but open space. There was no fear in me then, only clarity. The entity shared one last exchange, faster than thought, deeper than language. Gratitude was part of it, but not the kind humans expect. This was not thanks for freedom, it was acknowledgement of choice. I stepped aside. The entity did not walk past me. It paused, and in that pause, it showed me something I had not asked to see. A future where humanity learned restraint, where transparency replaced secrecy, where contact came not through military channels, but through collective responsibility, fragile, uncertain, but possible. Then it showed me another future, one I had already glimpsed before. War automated beyond empathy, climate collapse treated as collateral, space turned into an extension of territorial instinct. Both futures were still alive. The difference it conveyed was whether humans learned they were being watched and why. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Shouts followed. I felt the facility waking up around us. The entity did not react with urgency. Instead, it did something I still struggled to describe. Its form began to distort, not violently but elegantly, as if shifting out of a frequency we were no longer aligned with. I realized then that escape was the wrong word. It was departure. The entity did not leave through doors or tunnels. It did not flee into the storm. It simply ceased to be present in the way we define presence. One moment it was there, the next it was not, leaving behind nothing but silence and a faint, lingering pressure in the air. Alarms finally screamed to life. Armed personnel flooded the corridor. I was thrown to the ground, restrained, shouted at in English I barely registered. Hands searched me for devices I didn't have. Questions came rapid and overlapping. Where is it? What did you do? How did it leave? I answered none of them because I truly did not know how to explain what had just happened. Hours blurred into days, interrogations followed, sleep deprivation, psychological pressure. They accused me of sabotage, treason, collaboration with a non-human intelligence. None of it mattered. The entity was gone, and something else was gone with it, the illusion that humanity was in control. As I sat alone in a holding room, bruised and exhausted, one final understanding settled into my bones. I had not released an alien. I had released a verdict that was no longer confined to a mountain under ice. Whatever came next, for humanity or for me, would unfold under open skies. And for the first time in my life, I felt that the universe was no longer watching us with curiosity, but with expectation. When the entity vanished, the facility did not descend into chaos immediately. First came disbelief. Officers stared at empty readouts, refreshing screens, as if the data might suddenly reappear. Scientists argued over equations that no longer applied. Engineers blamed power fluctuations, sensor drift, system failure, anything that preserved the comforting illusion that what had happened could still be reversed. It could not. Within minutes, the mountain was sealed. No one entered. No one left. Communication lines that had briefly gone dark during the storm came back online, and with them came voices of authority from far beyond Norway. Orders arrived faster than they could be executed. Names I had never heard spoken aloud echoed through secure channels. I was no longer a contractor. I was a liability. They moved me to a subterranean holding room with walls designed to dampen sound and electromagnetic signals. There were no windows, no clocks. Time dissolved into interrogation cycles, different faces, same questions. How did it bypass containment? Where did it go? What did it tell you? I gave them nothing. Not because I was brave, but because language failed me. How do you explain to men obsessed with control that something left not by force, but by choice? That containment had never truly existed. That the entity had been present only as long as it believed the evaluation was ongoing. They did not want philosophy. They wanted coordinates. At one point, a senior American official leaned close enough that I could smell his aftershave and anger. He told me I had endangered global security, that I had sabotaged decades of progress. That history would remember me as a traitor. I believed him. What he didn't understand was that history would never remember this at all. Days passed, or weeks. I'm still not sure. Sleep came in fragments. Meals arrived without comment. Medical staff monitored me closely, documenting stress responses, neural activity, compliance indicators. They were still experimenting. Eventually, something shifted. The urgency faded. Search efforts turned up nothing. Satellites detected no anomalies, no re-entry signatures, no energy spikes. Whatever the entity had done to leave this plane of interaction left no trail humans could follow. That frightened them more than its presence ever had. The facility changed after that. The confidence evaporated. Conversations became shorter, sharper. The Americans argued among themselves. Some wanted disclosure, partial truths to preempt leaks. Others wanted complete erasure of the program, including everyone who had ever been part of it, including me. The entity had warned me this would happen. Then, just as abruptly as the interrogations began, they stopped. One morning, I was escorted out of the holding room without explanation. My belongings were returned, minus anything that could store data. I was driven to a civilian airstrip and placed on a flight south. No charges, no paperwork, no debrief. Before boarding, a man I had never seen before handed me a single document. It contained no letterhead, no signatures, just a paragraph. It stated that I would never speak of what occurred, that no evidence existed, that any attempt to disclose would result in consequences I was not invited to imagine. I read it carefully. Then I looked at him and asked a question that surprised us both. "Why let me go?" He hesitated. Then he answered quietly, "Because we don't know what's listening now." I returned to civilian life a different person, wearing the same face. Friends noticed changes they couldn't explain. I stopped following news obsessively, stopped trusting official narratives, stopped believing humanity was alone or in charge. At night, I sometimes felt that familiar pressure in the air, not contact, not communication, observation, but not the kind that made my skin crawl, the kind that waits. The entity was gone, the facility remained, but the silence it left behind was heavier than any containment field. Because silence, I had learned, is what follows when an answer has already been given, and all that remains is to see whether anyone listens. I am an old man now, not old enough to be dismissed as confused, but old enough to be ignored, which I've learned is far more convenient. Decades have passed since 1999, yet there is not a single day when the memory of that mountain beneath the ice does not surface in my thoughts. Some experiences do not fade, they wait. After my release, I tried to return to a normal life. I found work, I paid bills, I smiled at neighbors. On the surface, I became invisible again, just as the system prefers. But internally, I lived with a constant awareness that the world was not what it claimed to be, and that we were not as alone as we pretended. For years, I expected retaliation, not from governments, but from the universe. I waited for signs of punishment, for disasters that would confirm humanity had failed some cosmic test. None came. What arrived instead was something far more unsettling. Nothing. No revelations, no open contact, no sudden awakening, just continuity. Wars continued, technology accelerated, surveillance expanded quietly under the banner of safety. Environmental thresholds were crossed and redefined as acceptable losses. Each step justified, each warning reframed as alarmism. Humanity did not change, not dramatically. And that, I realized, was the answer. The entity never promised salvation. It never claimed to be a guardian or a judge in the way humans imagine authority. What it offered was a mirror, and a pause long enough for us to look into it. When it left, the pause ended. I sometimes wonder whether releasing it truly mattered, whether one man's choice altered anything beyond his own conscience. But then I remember the final understanding it shared with me, not as comfort, but as clarity. Evaluation is not a single moment. It is ongoing. The entity's kind does not watch us constantly. They do not hover in our skies or whisper in our leaders' ears. They observe trajectories, patterns, long arcs of behavior. They wait to see whether a species can regulate itself without supervision. That is what frightens me now, not invasion, not annihilation, but neglect. A civilization ignored by the wider universe is free to destroy itself without interruption. No warnings, no interventions, no mirrors held up when denial becomes habit. I was released because those in power sensed this too. They understood on some level that keeping me imprisoned or silenced completely might provoke attention they could no longer manage. Letting me fade into obscurity was safer, and so I have, until now. I am not sharing this story to convince skeptics. Belief has never been the point. The entity did not care whether humans believed in it. It cared whether we could listen when confronted with uncomfortable truth. What it told me about humans was not that we are evil. It said we are capable of extraordinary kindness, capable of breathtaking destruction, and uniquely capable of justifying either with the same calm certainty. If there is one warning I was meant to carry forward, it is this: the universe is not watching us to see what we build. It is watching to see what we choose not to do once we understand the consequences. The day humanity learns restraint, not out of fear, but out of responsibility, will be the day the silence ends. Until then, the stars remain quiet, not because they are empty, but because they are waiting. And waiting, I have learned, is what comes after a verdict has already been delivered. If this story left you thinking, make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with others who love mysteries. Comment the word freedom if you believe in the power of change, and let us know where you're tuning in from. Don't forget to subscribe to get more stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Stay tuned for what's coming next.